Hello, mate, to Thrive Nation. Today's really important because we need more scientists like Ben Katz, and he's on the show. And I just want to wish him a really warm welcome to a South African podcast, the number one health and wellness podcast that is produced in Africa. Welcome, Ben.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Brilliant. I want to dive in. People want to listen and hear the most important things in the beginning and sort of catch their attention. And so the question I'm going to
Mhm.
ask you is, why should adults that are listening and their kids not eat M&Ms? I've got a packet right here if you're on YouTube, but why
Mhm.
shouldn't they be eating M&Ms?
Well, so M&Ms, if you actually just look at the back of the packaging and take a look at the serving size, it's one of these things that's very amazing. If you look at the serving size about how many grams of an M&M you're supposed to eat, I did this for a high school class, and then weigh that out. It's like six M&Ms or something like that. And so you're like, why is the serving size so much lower for M&Ms? It's never just the entire bag. They kind of always kind of are like, no, no, don't eat too many of these M&Ms. Compared to like if you had a Hershey's bar, it'd say eat the whole bar. That's one serving size, which makes kind of sense. And so it seems like there's a lot of extra sugar because they have this candy coating, but also I have found much higher levels of caffeine in the chocolate in M&Ms. And this includes all the M&M varieties. If you have a peanut M&M, the chocolate that's around the peanut seems to be, I mean, since it's chocolate, there's going to be variable levels of caffeine depending on how the chocolate is processed. Chocolate can come, if you start looking at the label on the back of food ingredients, and if you look at like hot cocoa labels and chocolate labels, the source of the caffeine could be coming from something called like cacao liquor versus cacao, powder. And so there's all these different industry terminologies for what type of cacao product they're using. And so I'm assuming I don't know you can't ever really prove if it's malicious, but just at the mass spec level, when you start checking different chocolate products, M&Ms particularly stand out as one that's not good for children, especially before bed. There is a significant amount of caffeine in there. We're working on quantifying it. And the best way to quantify these things, in my opinion, if they were going to do some sort of regulation or at least food labeling, is by serving size. So you have to pay attention to the serving size that's suggested on the packaging.
But I mean, what is the ratio of theobromine and the things that are really important and the caffeine? Because I think people are listening
Exactly.
and saying, you know what? Oh my goodness, I can only eat six M&Ms. I thought I could eat as many M&Ms as I could eat Smarties.
Exactly.
Now, I don't know if you use mass spectrometry, and we're going to go into your background. You're probably listening. I've got a very important scientist who's actually checking on all these products, and I think it's needed because Big Food is not a benevolent organization whatsoever, and they are going to try and take the loopholes. And they are, I think it's pretty much malicious. I mean, if you think what caffeine's going to do to kids, if they have like 25 or 30, a whole bag of M&Ms, all that caffeine, that's not good for their nervous systems.
Right,
I had
especially
a
while you're coming up
pediatrician
in
on the
stage.
show like last
Yeah.
week, and he said 50% of children have a chronic disease, 50%, and one in six have neurodevelopmental problems. So tell us about that sort of breakdown, what's different about M&Ms.
Well, so it's just the what you got at it a little bit with the caffeine to theobromine ratio. So if you were going to want to try to prove that there's something happening in processing, or even if exogenous caffeine is being added to a product, you want to look at these theobromine. So theobromine should be the prevalent alkaloid in coffee and chocolate. So there should be more theobromine. And so it should be almost 10 times as much theobromine as caffeine if you had like a cacao nib or something like that, like naturally sourced chocolate. And that's kind of the reverse ratio if you look at coffee. Coffee will also have some theobromine, and that's why people be like, oh, this coffee has kind of a chocolatey undertone. But it's the reverse, where there's 90-95% caffeine in coffee and like 5% theobromine. So depending on the plant that's producing these molecules, they can skew kind of which one they're producing. And so where it's generally known that chocolate has caffeine, the ratio of the theobromine chocolatey bitter molecule, which doesn't have much stimulant properties, to the caffeine ratio is what people really should be checking. And so that's kind of what I've been looking at. And the ratio for M&Ms specifically is nearly reversed. It's almost the ratio that you see in coffee. It's like 90% caffeine, 10% theobromine. And so you're like, okay, maybe there's some sort of roasting process that they're using in their chocolate factory, or some sort of extraction process when they're making the chocolate liqueur to put into their product that's changing these ratios. But there's no way to know because they're not going to report this. They're not going to let you into these types of factories to see how they're being produced. And chocolate manufacturing is pretty closely guarded on the really the food ingredient level. So it may even be far before Hershey's gets a hold of it,
But Ben, I mean, that's crazy. So our kids could be just having like just absolutely caffeine at a small, young age. I mean, they go to parties. I
And
mean, my daughter
think
goes to
about it with
parties.
behavior, right? So if you're blaming the child's behavior, hyperactivity on something else, but you haven't thought about chocolate, and you've just been assuming that the levels of caffeine in chocolate or M&Ms are very low, then start attaching these two things in your thought process. When you evaluate a child, it looks like this child is always hyperactive at night. You don't know what's going on. Be like, okay, maybe there is a source of caffeine in their diet that we didn't suspect, and so you could start doing some elimination to try to figure out where it's coming from. So I wouldn't just assume that all chocolate is created equal. You mentioned the Kinder Egg, right? So you showed the
Yeah.
Kinder Egg. Kinder Egg, I did check, and I can only test the ones that are here in California, but
Mm.
that was a proper chocolate theobromine ratio where there was 90%, maybe not exactly 90%, but there was a higher amount of theobromine than there was caffeine. And so you're like, okay, this is a chocolate product that at least was, especially since it's marketed directly to children, it was taking into consideration the caffeine level in the product. And so that's good to see. So it definitely, all chocolate is not created equal. And I don't think I'm the only person that's publishing results on this. There's different ways to do mass spec. I'm doing mass spec in more of a discovery fashion where I'm just trying to find molecules. There are other mass spec techniques which are very quantitative, give you these very precise concentrations. And I did some research on this. Just you can just search papers or websites on the internet, and there are a lot of sites that start to tell you the amount of caffeine in different candy bars and how much in different chocolates there are. So you could kind of research this on your own and try to figure out which ones to avoid,
Mm.
or at least for have your
So
children avoid.
the ideal ratio is 90% theobromine and then 10% caffeine in chocolate, which is what Kinder has. And I think Kinder's imported here in Africa, so I don't think we're going to have a problem there. The M&Ms come from overseas as well, so people got to stay away from those, especially for their children, because that's not good for their brain.
Mhm.
All right, so how do you do it if you miss the mass spec or mass spectrometry? Just maybe explain what that is, and you're a scientist doing that because someone's thinking, okay, I've heard
Yeah.
Benjamin Katz is a scientist. Now, how does he prove that actually M&Ms are not so good because of the high caffeine content?
Yeah, so the first thing you need to do is come up with an extraction protocol. And there is on my YouTube channel, we actually made this kind of a nice high school outreach lab. So it allows students here in California, there are magnet schools now that are starting to have kind of low-end mass spectrometers in the advanced chemistry classes. And so they're starting to need laboratories that can allow them to use those. And I think the most relatable thing is for the students to start looking at food that they're eating that they can get from their neighborhoods, and so it's a fun project. They can bring in a candy bar and try to analyze the caffeine, specifically the theobromine to caffeine ratio. And so you can see that lab where we actually go and buy the candy bars. We get some which are dark chocolate, so like 70% cacao. We get some that are milk chocolate. We get some M&Ms. And then we show that the first thing you need to do really is we're trying to keep everything kind of safe for children in a high school lab. So we're doing simple extractions like hot water to melt the chocolate, centrifugation, then to spin out the solids. So you can get like basically a tea or coffee extract of the chocolate. So you're making a hot chocolate, but you're getting rid of all the things that aren't soluble. And then, caffeine is known, and you can look it up in a scientific Merck index to see the solubility of caffeine, and it's fully soluble at even high concentrations in hot water. So you can be confident that you extracted all the caffeine away from all of the other stuff, the milk, fat, and the proteins and things like that in the chocolate.
Brilliant. So
Then where you do a liquid, kind of like a dilution. So it's very simple, just centrifugation, dilution of the water extract, and then we run it on a mass spectrometer. So that's the first part's the sample prep. The second part is how do you analyze it? So into a mass spec, you could just send all of your molecules, all the different things that are in that liquid sample into the mass spec at once, but they'd have lots of overlap and it would be difficult to see some things that are lower abundance because the higher abundance things would suppress them. So what we do is we run something called liquid chromatography. So chromatography is like a stationary bead. You can think of it as like a water filtration system, right? And things will run, you'll put your sample on the front of this long column, and which is packed full of a bed of beads that have a certain affinity for some molecules versus another, and you'll run a gradient. You're basically going to flush things off in order of how hydrophobic they are by using a solvent gradient. And so that's what they would call liquid chromatography. So you're then separating molecules across this long stationary phase and sending them into your mass spec individually or into smaller packets of just a couple molecules at a time. And that allows you to create what's called an LCMS chromatogram. So where you'd see peaks coming off with their mass spec. So I'll show those on mine where you have all these peaks lined up, let's say over 10 or 15 minutes. And then inside each one of those peaks is going to be mass spec data. And so early in the kind of polar area, you'll see caffeine come out and theobromine come out as individual peaks at their respective masses. And then you can do integration under the size of those peaks to get the ratio. A lot of people are like, okay, like if you go really advanced, you're like, there's a lot of molecules that have the exact same elemental formula. They have the exact same parent mass. How would you tell them apart? So the mass spec also has a mode where you can fragment molecules in the gas phase inside the mass spectrometer, breaking their chemical bonds based on the position of where those chemical bonds are located. And then that will match a database. So the fragment masses that are created, it's called the MS, secondary fragmentation, of the masses will tie to a database. I use a Canadian database for database searching, and it's free and open access. And if you have those masses, even if you're a high school lab, you can search these free databases and they will help you give confidence to your identifications.
Okay.
And
so
find
in summary,
everything, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty scientific, it's data driven. If there's another scientist, then they should come up with the exact same conclusions and that. So we can
publish your methods and you follow methods that you could replicate on your instruments. Yep.
All right. So where did you get your science degree? If people want to check you out and
yeah,
see your
Georgia
qualifications.
Tech. You can my LinkedIn and yeah, Georgia Tech's great school. And then I was at Kansas State University for 7 years doing mass spec core facility as well. So I was a lot more focused on food and ag science. I kind of like, this is the way I sell it, is I like I used to work for the other side. Kansas State, I did most of the scale up for chemical plants, worked with big food manufacturers. Got to see how it all worked. You know, the thing I like to say though is you don't want to vilify the food industry too much, processed food, because if you ask people whether or not we are in a food surplus or a food shortage worldwide, they would be like, oh, there's a lot of food. And that's not the truth. You know, every year you have to grow food for the entire planet. It's not one of these resources you could stockpile. You have to continue every year. It's like a boom or bust. You could have a famine in one part of the world because there's no crops growing because of some situation. And so on a net average, we seem to be in a food deficit. So it's kind of, if you have these high level meetings with people in the agriculture space, they do have a lot of things to consider about how to best use the resources that we have. And so you want to create processed food with thought and scientific thought in mind that preserves, you know, the healthiness of the population. But you do need to utilize resources very efficiently.
No, for
And
sure.
so and so there's this balance, of course, where you want to look at different processes. So one of the things that like I do when I was in Kansas State is try to transition a petroleum derived commodity to a natural waste stream derived commodity. So let's say there's a big push to do kind of green chemistry, which is typically fermentation based chemistry using renewable feedstocks. And so that's a good way to make you know, industrial commodities that used to come from petroleum. And so there's a lot of things you can do in food science that help expand the use of existing food. And so that's really important.
But I mean, if you just look at the health and what's happening in the chronic disease, then we've got a real problem with ultra processed foods, you know.
Ultra processed foods, you have to start when they shift ultra processed foods more towards profit, or without enough thought process and knowledge, then you start seeing lots of problems, and they're not, they sometimes won't see the problems for generations to come. So it's kind of a difficult situation. So a lot of the things that I think about are, let's say you have gluten intolerance that's creeping up in your population. Well, why are they processing wheat protein with specific with specific enzymes that could potentially cause this wheat allergy to develop in the population? And they're doing it because some sort of flavor modification, some sort of flow process modification. So the thought process behind the food scientists sometimes are related more to the process of making the food than to the nutrition of the human. And so that balance needs to be thought about more as processed foods progress, And so
Yeah, but those
I don't think
food
they're ever going to go
scientists,
away, processed
yeah, but
foods.
those food scientists, Ben, are working for organizations that are feeding shareholders, and their greatest mandate is
Yeah,
to make as cheap as possible, with as much profit as possible, as addictive as possible, as with all the different tastes. I mean, we had food scientists on, Joan Ifland, on in terms of the addiction model that was taken from the 85, 86, 87, the biggest tobacco companies buying those
exactly.
different food companies. So I think it's a lot more malicious than that. And I don't think they're looking at saying, hang on, how are we going to actually help the population in terms of our obesity
They're thinking
epidemic?
commodities wise, right? They're thinking, how can I get the most of that commodity and then make the most money off of that commodity? And what are all the different things that I can do? And so the question is how do you force change to, you got it, like a system that developed in the 60s and 70s and has these kind of grandfathered in laws, especially in the United States, where you have entire organizations that are able to submit things to this generally recognized as safe food status without a whole lot of oversight and regulation. So an organization that I like to bring up, if you wanted to, like, I don't want to vilify anybody, but to look at the way they're approving things, is this organization in the United States called FEMA. This is not the FEMA Emergency Management Company, but the Flavors and Extractives Manufacturing Association. So flavors and extractives manufacturing has been around, like you say, since the 60s and 70s. It had a lot of work in the tobacco space as well. They basically say that if I approve an extractive, like I make licorice extract or cocoa extract for chocolate flavor, nobody needs to check it. It's a food ingredient listed as a Flavors and Extractives Manufacturing Association approved product. So it's a manufacturers association. The companies that make it have their own association, no regulation or oversight by any central party. And they can then submit their own generally recognized as safe product into the food pipeline and just be like, hey, this is approved by us. And so that is so what you have to do in processed food, in my opinion, is start looking at the areas where there's the exceptions, right? So there's an ingredient on the back of every product you see that says natural and artificial flavors. What are they hiding in that, right? There's a exception in the rules for toothpaste and dental products, and they use the word flavor. That's the approved word that FEMA has allowed. What is in that flavor category? What are all the things that are approved to be put in that flavor? How many thousands of ingredients can you stick in flavor? And then my favorite is I looked at these, I don't know if they've made them there in South Africa, but native shampoo and conditioner, where they say 10 ingredients only. You can trust us. There's only 10 ingredients in this shampoo and conditioner, except there's a ingredient called fragrance.
Yeah.
So in cosmetics, be suspicious of the ingredient label fragrance. How many things can they put into that fragrance category? They're saying that they don't want to tell you what it is because that's a proprietary trademark of their product. They don't want people to be able to reverse engineer their precious product. But really, they're hiding everything that they don't want to tell you is in the product in that ingredient. And so that's the deceptiveness that I see in industry.
Yeah, now Ben, you got to tell us about the other products that we spoke about kombucha. I think that's important. But what
Yeah,
about the other
shampoos.
products that you found that have got the right ratios, whether it's theobromine to caffeine? Tell us about, the dangers that people might be adopting and they're not even knowing it because they're looking at the labels and they think chocolate's chocolate or they think kombucha's
Yeah.
kombucha. So give us a list of maybe the top 5 or top 10 that you found over the
Yeah, I
years.
think I was kind of getting at it. The ones that I found, you'll find caffeine in really silly places where I am not too concerned about it because there is, it seems like it's a small amount, but it's sneaking in through a food ingredient from flavors and extractives, right? So anything that's kind of strange that would have some caffeine in it, and I haven't checked enough products to know for sure, but a lot of, I find it in hot dogs. I find it in sausage products sometimes. And so what you have to do is you have to think like, okay, there's like and in Mexican cuisine, there's like a mole, right? A mole is chocolate derived. And so you have to think about, like I was saying, the flavor category, what is in that flavor category? And so things that could have this chocolate flavor for savory products as well as sweet products are potentially interesting to look at. But I haven't looked at enough sausages to really like, say it's really high in some product or another.
Yeah, but who is looking at these, Ben? Because I mean, the public's
I don't
unaware.
think
You've
anybody's
just
checking that. It's crazy. I
no, no,
think
but
there's
Ben,
just,
you've got to tell us more products now because let's talk about
yeah.
kombucha. You've told us about M&Ms. You've opened my eyes since I've heard that. I've been in the health industry for 25 years. I've got
Yeah.
children, and now you're telling me the serving size is 6, and these kids go and they can have
Gotta watch
55 in
out
a party.
for how many M&Ms. Yeah, let me try to think off the top of my head. Anything that's kind of really particularly interesting. The caffeine thing's definitely the thing that was most interesting for me as a kid. There's one other class of molecules. I've talked about it on in my YouTube channel. I made I at the last Mass Spec conference, I had a poster that was tied to a bunch of Instagram posts about a molecule class called synthetic cooling agents. This is something that I'm pretty passionate about. That's another class of molecules that have been snuck through using this FEMA generally recognized as safe authorization from like probably the 70s or so. So these are menthol mimics. They are synthetic molecules that have a cooling effect like menthol, but they are not menthol. So there was a big push back in like the 70s. There's a company called Wilkinson Sword, a defense contractor, that partnered with Big Tobacco and Gillette making straight razors. And so there was originally these molecules called synthetic cooling agents. They were developed because safety razors, when you use them on your face, they hurt. Makes sense. They weren't that good at making razors, right? And so in the shaving creams and in the little strips on the safety razors, they would put a synthetic cooling agent, a non-menthol synthetic cooling agent. And what these do is they give that cooling effect and they actually block pain sensation. So they're a trip A, trip M agonists, similar to menthol. And so they have some local anesthesia properties, which is really good for shaving. But then Philip Morris comes in and they're like, hey, if we put these instead of menthol in cigarettes, people won't realize because the cool thing about non-synthetic cooling agents is they got rid of the minty flavor. They just kept the cooling sensation. And so then when you're using, when you're smoking cigarettes, you don't cough as much because you have this suppressive effect and it doesn't hurt. And so now this product over the last 50, 60 years has moved into everything. It's really big in vaporizers, so I think you would cough like crazy and it would hurt if you used a vape without synthetic cooling agent. So they put in the flavor category into all vapes, and then including if you have flavor regulations, like in California, we have no flavor allowed because of regulations. They petitioned California so that they weren't considered a flavor. So this big lobby for these synthetic cooling agents is strong enough where they'll say, hey, in some industries, we're not considered a flavor, so we don't have to be regulated out. We can still be used. And in some industries, we are a flavor, so we don't have to tell you that we're in there. And so I see it in all toothpastes. all mouthwash. And so this is another class of molecule. You can do your own research on these compounds called WS, so Wilkinson sword, WS3 and WS23. There's not a lot of literature. So there really just needs, again, I'm not a medical doctor. I'm a chemist. And so I like to stay in my lane. My lane is this is what's in food ingredients. There's not enough research out there from the medical guys on this. It seems like it has been pushed through and generally recognized as safe really early without enough actual research. And so I'm trying to bring awareness to things like synthetic cooling agents. Be like, hey, we should do more medical studies to see if these things are safe instead of continually spreading them in every product. I mean, the amount of in chewing gum, any product that says chill or ice on it, synthetic cooling agents. So if you're trying to avoid these things now, it's becoming quite challenging.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, and tell us about the kombucha, because we were talking offline. I found that very, very interesting because
Yeah.
people are totally unaware and they're giving their kids kombucha, saying, oh, it's good for the gut microbiome, but they're not realizing what's inside.
Yeah. So realize that kombucha is black tea, and depending on how dark the kombucha is, how long it's been brewed for, there will be a lot of caffeine. And so the kombucha that I was concerned about is this GT. This is a very popular kombucha, this GT Synergy kombucha. It's 16. So it's the problem I have is that the serving size on the recommended serving is one bottle. So they're saying you can drink 16 ounces of this kombucha. But if you, I mean, tea does have less caffeine per serving size than coffee. However, typically a coffee serving size is 8 ounces, sometimes even 4 ounces for shots of espresso. So I'd say that this 16-ounce beverage, if you drink the entire thing, has the same amount of caffeine as a 4-ounce espresso. So you're like, if you start putting it into terms of things that people understand, nobody's going to drink an entire bottle of kombucha before bed if they know that it's equivalent to taking a double shot of espresso. And so you got to kind of like, you got to detach what these are and start putting them in, you know, these terms where people can be like, hey, this is equivalent to about that. So if you're like, okay, a whole bag of M&Ms, we have to do the quant on it, could be equivalent to in shots of espresso, then you're like, maybe we should start putting the concentration of caffeine into terms that people can understand instead of just
Exactly.
label. Yeah.
Do you know the composition of
I've been checking kombuchas, and it's all over the place at the moment to see. Yeah.
I think that's so powerful because people are unaware
But
once
the story
again.
I don't believe. So the story, if you talk to the PR divisions of a lot of these kombucha companies, the story out there is that they know there's caffeine in black tea. They use that in the kombucha fermentation process, but then they claim that it's naturally decaffeinated because the microbes in the kombucha process are eating the caffeine. And I don't know if I buy that. I've not found any literature that supports that. It's kind of a wise tale story, but I would love to see proof, because if I compare black tea, like Peak's black tea jugs, volume to volume, to the kombucha, sometimes the kombucha is higher in caffeine than straight black tea. And so you're like, okay, so I don't think there's a loss of caffeine in the fermentation process.
Well, is that the only brand you know, or the other brands, or how many brands have more caffeine than they
I've
should?
only done that one, and I've done one called Dr. Brew Doctor kombucha. That one was a little bit lower.
How
I'm
much
not trying to
caffeine do they
too
have in,
much.
Ben? What is the ratio? Do they also have theobromine and then
All
caffeine?
caffeine, right? So there's no in tea, there's no other minor alkaloid that I'm looking at. It's just caffeine. But that gets to another kind of interesting point. So when you talk about caffeine, you talk about two categories of caffeine. You have naturally derived caffeine, which is going to come from the extract of coffee or tea or green coffee. And you have what they call caffeine anhydrous, which is going to be in your sodas. You know, it's crazy to say this, right? But I feel like synthetic caffeine anhydrous is a safer product. And so, and I make the same statement when, you know, nicotine is not a safe product. We know nicotine is addictive. Nicotine is not healthy for you. However, nicotine that is synthetically derived appears to be cleaner and better than nicotine that is tobacco derived. And so this same comparison between naturally derived and synthetically derived gets to the minor alkaloids that come along with it. So think about it. If you're making a natural caffeine product from tea or waste streams from coffee or something that, it would be thrown out anyways, you're not just concentrating the caffeine molecule, you're concentrating all these other minor xanthan alkaloids, which are related to caffeine, because plants don't produce one thing. Plants produce a collection of molecules, right? Ratios of a big class of molecules. There's one primary, but there's a lot of minor ones. So if you concentrate that entire thing in some process and then use that as your source of caffeine, you could accidentally enrich a minor alkaloid that's similar to caffeine that has a higher toxicity than caffeine itself. And so that's a big concern for these really high energy drink products where they're putting in 200, 300 milligrams of caffeine, but then they say naturally derived caffeine. I typically try to avoid those because you try to think what else could be coming along with that naturally derived caffeine when you concentrate it that much. And so that's something that I like to think about. So if you're going to drink a lot of caffeine, it's crazy to say it, but maybe soda, which uses caffeine anhydrous, or diet soda, is a better source of caffeine than a concentrated source of caffeine, where the best source of caffeine is still like a naturally brewed tea or coffee, because nothing has been adulterated in all of those ratios. But you have to think about, so natural best, but natural concentrate worse. So it's a very strange thing to think about. Yeah.
No, I got you, because the one is controlled, the one is not controlled, and you don't know what actually is.
You don't know what the process is. Exactly. When you brew coffee, you see the beans, you know what happens. You brewed it, you know what happens. Ratios should be what the plant has. But anytime they go and do some sort of process you can't control in the food space, and they do an enrichment or a concentration, you don't know what happened in that process.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you know the ratio of like decaffeinated in the process, being a chemist and a scientist, what happens? I know they use different mechanisms. A lot of people.
Yeah, it seems, I just did a coffee tour with a couple different coffee companies on this. So there is a regulated level of I think it's like 3 milligrams or less. So they do remove pretty much all the caffeine. It seems like people are consolidated around using ethyl acetate solvent as the decaffeination approach. It's definitely better than using dichloromethane. That seems to be an approach as well. I don't know what other countries are doing. The best approach would be supercritical fluid extraction. And so it's probably just getting it cost. So, you'd want everyone to use supercritical fluid extraction with supercritical CO2, because that would be the cleanest way to pull out just the caffeine. The ethyl acetate, it's definitely, I don't think it's really super toxic. But yeah, you have a solvent, it probably goes away. They remove the caffeine before the roasting process. So the roasting process is at a high temperature, and the solvent would probably be volatilized out. The thing I like to think about with decaffeinated coffee is it changes the way the coffee, everything about the coffee, right? It opens up the bean. You got to think about it. You got to remove the caffeine from the entire bean, which means you have to permeate the whole coffee bean somehow, which basically changes the integrity and structure of the coffee bean prior to being roasted. And so it just changes the coffee bean kind of entirely.
Good.
So I don't know if it's for better or worse. I just know that you have basically two completely different products, caffeinated and decaffeinated coffee.
But I mean, I'm seeing all these central nervous system, problems in my practice over 25 years, and ADHD, and kids that are not coping, teenagers that can't focus, and there's just no real place that they can have and go and look at the caffeine theobromine sort of ratio. Is there a website? I mean, we're online now. Do you have websites?
Yeah, we could search. I think I did some original research on trying to find just candy bars with caffeine ratios, but the thing you want to look for is quantitative work using an instrument called a triple quadruple mass spectrometer.
So if someone's listening now, Ben, what do they type in and how do they find a list of saying, hang on, I've got problems,
Yeah,
I've got
let's
problems.
see. Let's see if I can Google search it and find it. Caffeine levels. I think there was like an organization out there that was trying to do it.
Because you've got a
But
great
yeah,
Instagram
I'd have to,
channel. So you could put this on your Instagram channel. You find
I
help
could
a
put
lot
it
of
up.
people.
I could try to do like a podcast deep
Ah.
dive into data that I can trust. Um, but yeah, there are a lot of people trying to get at this. I haven't done it in an incredibly controlled study. I haven't really focused on trying to yeah, put out like actual paper on these things. But yeah, it's good to bring awareness to it, but then you want to like try to see if you can find a trusted resource where there's some organization checking all these
Well,
things.
maybe we'll get something we can put in the show notes because I mean now
Yeah, yeah. Let's
we know about M&Ms and we know about Kinder, but I mean I have Lindt chocolate
I
like the 70% and the 78%
I
and
would all dark
85%.
chocolate. I would say, kids should avoid all dark chocolate. I mean, you should know that there's caffeine in this, but
But
it's
what are the ratios, Ben? I mean,
one of these things where like, you'd want to for children, I'd say below 10 milligrams of caffeine.
yeah, but I mean, what about myself? I'm having dark chocolate after my dinner. It's healthy, but
Yeah.
actually then it causes me to sort of clench my teeth. I don't sleep as well, affects my sleep
Yep.
scores,
Yep.
affects my REM sleep, my deep sleep, but we don't know how much caffeine's in Lindt chocolate or the Lindt dark balls. I mean,
Absolutely. And then you have to think that like not every chocolate is being manufactured in the exact same location with the same rules. So I don't know if you want to just single out a brand uh globally. There could be, M&Ms produced in multiple locations in multiple factories. There could be different varying levels batch to batch. It's something that's really kind of challenging to get a handle on. And so I think that, the best thing, it's for parents to be aware that chocolate contains enough caffeine to affect children's mood just in general.
mm,
And so I don't want to like stand behind any specific chocolate and say this is good chocolate, The Kinder Eggs do seem to be pretty good, but again, it's
okay.
just the one that I've tested. But yeah, I don't want to like I
No,
don't
no,
want to
yeah.
try to vouch for anything more than I can. But again, it's the idea of awareness, right?
Mm,
You really want the companies to stand behind a number. And so it'd be better if as you raise awareness, you try to put regulations in place that force labeling for caffeine.
mm,
The companies are capable of quantifying the amount of caffeine in the candy bars.
yeah.
Absolutely, they
But they
could do it.
won't. I mean, M&Ms, you can have six.
Well, they won't unless they're told they have to. Yes.
Exactly. And I
Yeah.
mean, M&Ms, who thought you could only have six as a serving? Who thought there was so much caffeine in there? No one did till I heard you. So, I mean,
Yeah.
we need to let the public know. So I've got to get those websites possibly from you to put them in the show notes. I think that's fundamentally
I'll
important.
try to look for a good trusted resource, not just like another person's blog, and then we can put them in the
Mm,
notes.
brilliant.
But yeah, finding this type of information, um, the Caffeine Informer is the site that I'm looking at.
Mm.
But again, you really want peer-reviewed real numbers, and so you got to kind of be careful out there. Yeah,
All right, let's talk
but
about like beauty products or medicinal mushrooms or anything else that you found, doesn't have the ingredients. We spoke about fragrance. I mean, that's a real
yeah. So
problem.
another one. So fragrance. Let's talk about. Yeah, we can wrap it up on fragrance because there is a really important issue on fragrance. That's another thing that I'd say where my passion projects are. It's caffeine and caffeine regulation. This idea of synthetic cooling agents, which are these TRPM agonists used to block pain, typically in situations where there would be pain. And so, and then there's this last category of fragrance. I'm very interested in fragrance, and it's in lotions too. So just realize that this category fragrance is all cosmetics, including lotions, sunscreens. There's this group of categories where you can use this word fragrance on the ingredient label to hide things, right? There are a class of compounds called macrocyclic musks, so synthetic musks. You can search it here. All right. So if you search synthetic musks and you get to the Wikipedia page,
Mm.
you can see in synthetic musks, there's this whole group of synthetic musks that have been used for a very long time. since like the early 1900s, even in the 1800s. They knew that you could take pheromones out of animals, out of their scent musk gland, and they would act as pheromones. And if you put them at small levels inside of perfumes and fragrances, they would attract the opposite sex. It's crazy. It's like almost magic. But when you talk about gender on colognes and perfumes, it's because there is research behind the pheromones they put in there that will cause your brain to think that the opposite sex has improved facial attractiveness.
Hmm.
So
Wow.
they're using these for a reason. And so there's a ton of these compounds. They all have different research around them. A lot of them, there's things like nitromusks that were kind of the original ones. Those have been banned. So you could first just be like, hey, I wonder if there's a banned one that's not allowed that's in there. So I've been checking very popular, expensive colognes and perfumes. I'm happy to take suggestions.
Yeah.
But specifically, there's a category called macrocyclic musks. If you scroll down in the Wikipedia page and you look at, there's macrocyclic lactones and macrocyclic ketones. These are very unique looking molecules. These are kind of the original ones that they isolated from like this scent gland of a civet. And they found out these worked incredibly well. They have, I would say, until you smell them by themselves, you'd be like, I've never smelled this molecule before in my entire life. Once you smell the molecule by itself and you smell what it smells like, the best way I can describe the odor of these cyclic musks is reminiscent, nostalgic. It triggers something in your brain where
Sure.
you're like, oh my God, I've smelled that my entire life. It's this familiarity, but without a known smell. You almost can't describe what the actual odor is. It's true pheromone recognition. It's super cool. As soon as you smell them, you can pick them out anywhere. I walk here on campus. We got like 20, 30,000 students, student body. If there's a class change and I smell the students walking by, now that I've smelled all these musks separately, I can pick them out. I can be like, wow, you can smell them in the air. They're very, very strong, very potent. The one that I like to bring to people's attention is there's one called, I guess it's called musk tea. And then there's another one called, I want to get the right one. There's so many of these things and they all kind of look exactly the same. This is like, I think it's called like ethylene brassylate. Ethylene, yeah. So it's called ethylene brassylate. It's a macrocyclic lactone. It's referred to as musk tea. This one has been, so there's I don't know if you've covered this or not, Steve, on the channel,
Mm.
but there is
Mm-mm.
a problem with children, specifically young girls, going into puberty too early,
Yeah,
very early.
precocious puberty. Yeah.
7, 8 years old. It's a huge problem. It seems like it's being tracked back to these pheromones. Ethylene brassylate, specifically this one musk tea, but probably since they all kind of look the same and mimic the same response, it's probably just a general problem with synthetic musks. I would say avoid all synthetic musks. So, especially on your young daughters, and I'm doing this with my young daughter,
Mm.
no fragrance shampoos, no fragrance conditioners and soaps. Since there is no recorded, I'm going to start trying to run more of these things because I have a good method that can detect these cyclic musks. See if I can try to find a fragrance containing shampoo that I can trust that doesn't have musks in it. But at the moment, if there is a fragrance label on a cosmetic product, including sunscreen, I like to make sure people realize, including sunscreen, if there's a fragrance category, they can hide these cyclic musks, which are endocrine disrupting, changing molecules, can seem to be causing early puberty in girls. They could hide those in that fragrance label. And so that's got another really big issue. There is scientific literature that's starting to come out that supports this. And so there does need to be better labeling on these fragrance categories, specifically for the cyclic musk category. These macrocyclic lactones are a serious problem.
So, and you don't know they're likely going to be if there's a word fragrance on the ingredient. So that could be on body creams, that could be
Yep.
on anything like that they put on to smell nice. My daughter likes to put all these smelly sort of lip glosses, and then paint her nails with these,
Yep.
smellies with fragrance, any fragrance that can cause as an
And then
endocrine
colognes and
disruptor.
perfumes, they're pretty much in all colognes and perfumes. It's one of these base smells that it's, the DuPont came out with this ethylene brassylate in the 1930s. It's just to show you how grandfathered this is into fragrance. It's so original. These molecules have been out since the like pre-war. These are 1920s, 1930s molecules. So there's no fragrance that they haven't been included in some small level at these points, unless people are trying to avoid them specifically. I would say that all fragrance categories could potentially include these things.
So who's revealing all this? I mean, I know you're doing work. Is there once again another, website that people can go to and, look at, the worst products?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I would just say do your research. It's the categories that I like to try to tell people about. So when you're looking at fragrances, you can go to these fragrance manufacturers' websites and see these molecules essentially, and kind of get an idea of all the things that are in that fragrance category. And then the same thing with the flavor category. Realize all the things that can be hidden in those flavor categories, and just kind of know. But there's just not a lot of good documentation. So as I analyze things on the channel, I try to post the unscripted results and show everybody what I find. I'm happy to take product suggestions. I am getting crazy busy. Lots of suggestions have been coming in. But I do try to prioritize children's health specifically. So if there's a children's health problem, the one area that I have not been focused on because I don't have the right instrumentation is metals. You have another guest that talks about metals. But there's this guy's channel that does look at lead specifically. And that is a huge concern. I just think there's lots of products that are being manufactured, specifically products for children with lead or lead-lined pieces of metal. And so you got to be cautious out there.
Yeah, and look, moms don't
I
have
think
time to go to
parents
the
need to think,
websites,
yeah,
they don't have time to go and research it. They don't have time. They're
yeah.
under pressure. They're working. So that's why I like to give them, if you've got a website, to say, listen, these products, this is what I found, so they can go to one
Yeah,
place.
so I don't have a website for the channel yet. I don't know how I'm gonna put it all together. We're probably eventually gonna try to do a physical book. So I'm more into book publishing for things like this. And so yeah, stay tuned. Stay tuned to the YouTube channel and the Instagram channel, and then I try to advertise everything on there. As I, it's a kind of a side project, a passion project that's kind of blown up here. And so I have to have to balance things. I do a lot of things at the university here that are different. And
Cool.
so lots of
What's the Instagram channel,
important.
Ben? And what is the YouTube
So
channel?
everything's under the moniker Mass Spec Everything. So Mass Spec Everything is the channel on YouTube and on Instagram. There's the TikTok. I try to keep the long form content on YouTube now, kind of like the full 9 to 10 minute video, and then edit it down for Instagram. And then for some of these kind of like slower, just kind of podcast type conversations, if I'm going to do a deep dive into a specific class of molecules, I have started putting out a Spotify podcast, Mass Spec Everything Pod. I think it's maybe the fourth. You guys want, homework assignment before we sign off here. If you go to the pod, and since we are on Spotify, the most interesting podcast, and I actually just put this podcast the 35-minute one, onto YouTube as well, so people could listen to it on there. It's called Herbicide Has Beef Fat in It. It's an episode about this molecule called polyethoxylated taloamide, which is used. I won't spare you with any of the details. I'll let you go ahead and hear it from the source. But it's a very crazy story about how in herbicide, like Roundup, there is another ingredient, an excipient, that's used to allow the delivery of the Roundup molecule that's derived from beef tallow.
Sure.
And so all of your vegetables are being sprayed with beef tallow without your knowledge.
Crazy.
And the funniest thing is that we do a deep dive on the podcast about how they use FDA exemptions in the United States to make it so even organic food can be sprayed because of some sort of emergency use exemption. And
Crazy.
so it's crazy once you kind of, you have all these tools now at your disposal. If you really want to research these things at night, you can kind of have a conversation with AI like I've been doing on the podcast. So I'll just talk with AI about a complex issue and try to dig as deep as I can. And so it's been kind of fun. So again, with that, if you guys have specific molecules or specific questions you want me to deep dive into, I'm happy to take direct messages, or you can email me directly at masspeceverything@gmail.com, and I'll do my best to dig into it and try to figure things out for you.
Well done. I really appreciate all your work, and just give a message of hope out there, because I know we've spoken about what
Yeah,
big corporates are hiding and what they're doing and not knowing about. I was shocked about M&Ms. I was shocked
yeah,
about, a lot of areas, but I mean, I think people might think, oh my goodness, I can't eat anything. Tell us some hope that's a story out there for
yeah.
the future.
Well, you definitely need to eat. So you can eat food, and then the positive message that, I'm not a medical doctor, but the positive message is the human body is very powerful and very strong. And never think that the damage is permanent and you're completely ruined. You can have lifestyle change, and you can change your healthiness, and you can find food that agrees with you. And so trust your own body and trust the way you feel. You can always find a food ingredient that you don't like, and it's not going to harm you so much that you can't correct the problem. So hope is not lost. Taste and eat food, and then trust how your body feels. And if you notice behavioral problems in your children, don't immediately think medication. Start thinking more about diet, exercise, and things that make people happy. There may be another reason that there's a problem. So try
Mm.
new things. There's lots of food out there, and find a balance that works for your
Mm.
lifestyle. So
Brilliant, Ben. And we'll link to also the detox sort of podcast that we've had done, because I think detox is really, really important, because it's almost
absolutely.
impossible to sort of avoid that. But I want to just declare favor and blessing over you, Ben. Thank you for the work you're doing. It is
Appreciate
exploding.
it.
We do need people like you, and I see you are passionate about it. So I've learned about a few products just from you, the kombuchas, the M&Ms, and the Kinders. And I think step by step, one product at a
Yep.
time, and just getting the truth out there, and how do we eat this elephant one bite at a time. So thank you so
Yep.
much.
All right. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.